What makes the best property investment, a flat or a house? That is the most common question for people beginning their property investing journey or getting started with buy-to-let. In this video, we're going to take a deep dive into what makes the better investment, flats or houses. And I'll also share with you my recommendations of what you should go for depending on your strategy, long-term aims and where you are in the country. So stay tuned. My name's Ranjan Bhattacharya. I've been investing in property for 30 years. You may have seen me on the hit Sky TV show Property Elevator, or you may have attended one of our property networking events in central London. Now, in my 30-year property investing career, I've invested in flats and houses. We've also built blocks of flats as well. And in this video, I'm going to give you my 2 pennies worth on what makes the best property investment when you're starting out. Okay, so let's take my trusty pen and go to the board. By the way, if you're new here, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon because we put out new content each and every week, all dedicated to helping you keep on top of your property investing game. So let's start with some definitions then. If you're buying a flat, it's going to be typically leasehold. If you're buying a house, it's going to be typically freehold. There are some leasehold houses, I'll come on to that in a little bit. And there's also something else called share of freehold flats. So let me just explain what these are all about so that you're better equipped when you're going out looking for property. So let's start with houses then. Most houses are sold as freehold. What that means is that you own the house, obviously. Hope you like my graphics, no expense spared there. But you also own the ground, the earth on which that house sits. And of course, you own that house, which is on that ground, forever. Now, when you're looking at a flat, which is leasehold, so here's my designer block of flats here. Let's say you own this flat here on the top floor, the penthouse. What actually happens is that someone else owns the ground that that flat sits on. Someone else owns the ground, and that person is the freeholder. What you own is a lease on one particular flat. A lease basically entitles you to this piece of space on the top floor here for a specified amount of time, which is normally 99 or 125 years or so. Now, share of freehold is a little bit of a blend of the two. So you still own a lease on your penthouse flat on the top, but you also own a share of the ground along with everyone else in that building. So in my example here, there are 4 flats in this block. You would own the lease on your flat plus a 25% share of the freehold, the ground on which it sits. Now, up north and in the Midlands, there are a whole bunch of freehold houses, which are a little bit strange, actually. Often the history behind that was because those houses were built in mining areas and there were coal mines underneath the ground. So what they did is they basically sold leasehold houses in those areas. So those are a little bit of an anomaly. I'm not really going to go into that. Generally speaking, people are first attracted to flats because basically they're cheaper. The other thing you find with flats versus houses is when you look at your rental yield, your gross rental yield is often more. So what's not there to like? I mean, you know, they're cheaper than houses, you get more rental yield, more gross rental yield than houses. Well, the thing not to like is ground rent and service charges. Now, remember, when you have a leasehold, there is a freeholder. And basically, as a leaseholder, you're a tenant and you have to pay the freeholder an annual ground rent. Now, in the old days, of course, ground rents were relatively cheap. I mean, they were often £1 a year or £10 a year. But in recent times, ground rents have got more and more expensive, particularly on new build apartments. £250 per year, even £500 a year are quite common these days. And the other thing is how that ground rent increases over time. There are some leases where they say that ground rents will double every 10 years. So you've always got to look at the lease to see what the ground rent is that you're actually paying, because that can really mount up over time. The other downside to leasehold property is, of course, the service charge. Running out of space here. Now, when you own a house, if the gutters go or the roof needs repairing or there's garden maintenance to do or something like that, then basically you're the freeholder, you sort that out. When you have a flat, you're basically responsible for the inside of your flat. The fabric of the building is the freeholder's responsibility. Any communal areas are the freeholder's responsibility. Any lifts or stairway access, any communal gardens, any roof, all of that is the responsibility of the freeholder. Even buildings insurance is something for the freeholder to arrange for the whole building. Now the freeholder will do that, they'll arrange for all those things to be done, but they're going to charge you a service charge for doing so. And this can really rack up. The danger properties tend to be new build flats, and God only knows why those seem to have very, very high service charges when they're brand new, but they do. But the other danger property type is mansion blocks, Victorian mansion blocks or mansion blocks in the 1930s with lots of ornate stonework on the outside and all of that, because those tend to have high maintenance costs. Now, when you are doing this for investment, you have to be thinking about, of course, the profitability of the whole deal. Now, if the service charge is too high, that can severely affect the profitability of that particular rental investment. Now, I've seen properties in London, 2-bedroom flats in London, in different blocks on the same street. One will have a service charge of about £2,000 a year. Another one, in a slightly more expensive to run block, will have a service charge of £5,000, £6,000 or £7,000 a year. But guess what? A 2-bedroom flat in either of those blocks will rent for exactly the same money. So the service charge and things like ground rent really affect your bottom line. And in property, when we talk about rentals, we look at gross yield, which is the total rent that comes in that you are making on a particular rental unit, and what we call net yield, which is the rent that you are left with after you've paid your costs. And in flats, one of your major costs is this ground rent and service charge. It does seem very strange to me that if you have a 3-bedroom family house, it's often cheaper to maintain that in a year than a much smaller 2-bedroom flat in terms of paying the annual service charge and upkeep. So initially, flats may be cheaper to buy than houses, but in terms of your profitability and your net yield, you will find more costs with the leasehold properties. When there are major works to your freehold house, like you need the roof doing, for example, then you just have to arrange for it yourself. When you're in a block of flats, that's the freeholder's responsibility. They will organise major works themselves, and you tend to find that because they're doing it in a bit more of a grand scale, it tends to be more expensive than if you were doing it yourself. One of the problems with leasehold properties is you can be ticking along nicely with your rental investment, and all of a sudden there's a problem with the building, the roof, or particularly in buildings with lifts, where a lift repair or replacement can run into tens of thousands of pounds. Then what the freeholder does is they issue a major works bill. They issue a major works notice to each one of the leaseholders, and you're basically down to pay a share of those costs, which can of course run into tens of thousands of pounds. And of course, if there are cladding issues, as it is affecting many properties right now, it's down to the leaseholders to deal with the costs of sorting that out. Now, I've missed out this guy here, the share freehold properties. Now, with these, you kind of have best of both worlds, because you are also the freeholder. You also have a share of the freehold. And typically what happens is there's a limited company that's set up where each one of the flat owners, the leaseholders, has a share in that limited company and corresponding voting rights and the like. So the great thing about this sort of setup is that you have more control over the costs of running and maintaining the upkeep of the building and its communal parts. In smaller blocks of, say, under 7 flats, often the leaseholders get together and manage the building rather informally. In larger blocks of flats, what happens is the leaseholders kind of vote for a management company to actually run the day-to-day of that particular block. And because the management agent is appointed directly by the leaseholders, you tend to find that service charges and maintenance costs are generally lower than in buildings which are leaseholder with a third-party freeholder. We'll get back to the video in just a moment, but what I wanted to really tell you about was what is the most exciting opportunity in property right now, and that is repurposing defunct commercial buildings to residential use. Now, most people don't really know where to start, what to look for, and how to exploit these opportunities, and that's why I've prepared 90 minutes of free training for you to get you started on this wonderful journey. You can register for this free training at property-workshop.com. Join me on that free training, and I'll leave you to enjoy the rest of the video. Now, one of the things I really don't like about leaseholds is the fact that it's a bit of a ticking time bomb. With freeholds, you own a house and you basically own that title forever. No one can take it away from you. With leasehold properties, of course, the lease ticks down. Now, you may have heard of a concept called virtual freehold. Don't be fooled, guys. Virtual freehold, basically the clue is in the name. Virtual. It means it's not a real freehold. It's essentially leasehold. And it's usually used where you have a 999-year lease. Now, I know life expectancy is going up and all of that, but listen, no one's going to live that long for 999 years. So what's the problem? The problem is that although you don't necessarily have to suffer the ticking time bomb aspect of a traditional lease,
Oh, not again.
you do have to suffer the lack of control and the high cost that you have with the service charge element. So what do I mean by the ticking time bomb? The ticking time bomb is what happens as the lease starts to tick down. Now, eventually, if it's a 99-year lease and at the end of the lease, that lease goes back to the freeholder. So you have Zippo. This starts to be a real problem as the lease ticks down below 70 years. When the number of years remaining on the lease is less than 70 years, it's very hard to get a mortgage on those things. And it's at that point that actually the value of those leasehold flats starts to diminish a bit. Now, of course, there are some rules and regulations in place that helps the leaseholder. As long as you've owned the property for 2 years, as long as you've owned your leasehold flat for 2 years, you can then send a notice to the freeholder telling them that basically you want to extend the lease. And you have a right to do so, but of course you have to pay the freeholder for the privilege. Now, handy tip, if you are buying a flat which has under 70 years left on the lease, then ask the existing seller to serve the Section 42 notice on the freeholder to exercise the right to basically extend the lease and transfer the benefit of that notice to you. That way, when you buy the property, you're good to go as far as extending the lease straight away without having to wait 2 years to own the property before you can exercise that right in your own name. If you are buying a flat on a short lease, then my advice to you is to fully check out the likelihood and probability of the freeholder playing ball with you in regards to giving you a leasehold extension. There is a legal process, but an unwilling freeholder can make life difficult if they want to. And of course, if your exit strategy is to flip that flat on, or perhaps refinance that flat onto a long-term mortgage after you've extended the lease, and the freeholder is just playing games and it's taken a couple of years to get that done, then that's a lot of grief and aggro that you don't need. Now, there is a process where leaseholders in a building can get together and collectively buy the freehold off the freeholder. Now, to qualify, of course, half the flat owners have to get together to do what's known as collective enfranchisement, which is the process of buying or forcing the freeholder to sell the freehold to you. But this is easier said than done, because you've got to spend a lot of time and energy getting your fellow leaseholders together, and you have to get at least 50% of them to agree. They've got to be willing, they've got to have fire in their belly that they want to do this too, and they've also got to have some cash funds, because the freeholder is not going to give you the freehold, you're going to have to buy it at what is assessed at today's market value. While this might be an interesting thing for owner-occupiers to do at evenings and weekends and what have you, as a property investor, You don't really want to be spending all your energies on some leasehold enfranchisement claim as opposed to continuing to scale and grow your property business. Now, with our old friend over here, the share of freehold flat, it's slightly different and better in a way. Yes, you have a lease, and yes, the lease ticks down, but because you own a share of the freehold, there's normally a provision in there that those leases are either very, very long or that a lease extension will automatically be granted by the freeholder because basically you own a share of that freehold. If you're enjoying this video, make sure you smash that like button. It'll mean that this video will be shared to more people like you who can benefit from this content. Now let's look at alterations that you can make to properties, because really, if you alter properties, what are alterations about? They're about adding value. And as a property investor, that's how you make your profit, really. Can you buy property cheap and can you add value to it? Now, depending on whether you've got flats or houses, you've got different rights on what you can do in terms of making alterations to the property to add value. When you have a freehold house and you own the ground on which it sits, you benefit from what are known as permitted development rights. Now, these allow you to basically extend the property without necessarily having full planning permission. So they allow you to do things like loft conversions and rear and side extensions and that kind of thing without having full planning permission. Now, houses come with permitted development rights. Flats do not. If you want to do anything to a flat, like extending it or something like that, you have to do so with full planning permission. So even if you want to make those alterations in a flat, for example, it might be a ground floor flat and you have a garden and you want to build a conservatory there or something like that, you'd have to apply for full planning permission. But you'd also have to get your freeholder to consent. And that usually means paying the freeholder a fee. Now, that doesn't just apply to extension, that applies to any alterations. So, for example, if you want to knock out a wall and make a room open plan, you will be moving or knocking down a load-bearing wall, you'll be putting a piece of steel in, you will have to get your freeholder's consent. A lot of people do stuff where they make a one-bedroom flat into a two-bedroom flat by moving the kitchen into the lounge and making it an open-plan kitchen lounge and making the former kitchen into a separate bedroom, and therefore making it a two-bedroom flat when it used to be a one-bedroom flat. Now, to do that and to sell it on as a two-bedroom flat, you're going to have to need that freeholder's consent, because that is an alteration. If I have a house and it's large enough and I want to do it, I can apply for planning permission to split this house into flats. And provided I get the planning permission, I'm good to go. If I have a very large flat and I want to split that flat into two, then I may get planning permission, but I can't go ahead with that split without the freeholder's consent. And the freeholder is not going to give that consent without you handing over quite a large slice of the profit. So with freehold properties, you have much more scope to add value through making alterations, through using permitted development rights, through extending the property, and also developments on the site itself. You may have a large garden that you can split off, a corner plot or something like that, where you can split off and build another house and so forth. Freehold properties give you far more scope for property development opportunity. So if you're looking to change around a property, make some alterations, add value, freehold is undoubtedly the choice. Now, if you're liking this, make sure you smash that like button and also subscribe and hit the bell icon, because we release content like this all the time. Now, as well as in altering the property, the freeholder can stick their oar in terms of what you can actually do with it and whether or not they give you permission to do what you want to do as an investor. With a freehold, you are free to do whatever you like. To find out what you can and can't do with a leasehold property, you have to revert to what's in the lease. What if it's in the lease, then that really defines the relationship between the leaseholder and the freeholder. Now, most flats were built for people to live in as opposed to for people to use as an investment or to let out. So do check what the lease actually says for buy to let. There are some leases kicking around which actually prohibit you letting the property out. Do check for that and have your solicitor check for that before buying that sort of property. There are some leases which will say you can let it out, but you have to ask the freeholder's permission, but that permission won't be unreasonably withheld. So what that usually means is paying them a fee. It might be 50 quid, it might be 100 quid, sending them a copy of their tenancy agreement every time a new tenant comes in. So that's just an additional cost if that provision is in your lease. Do also check if you want to follow an HMO strategy, whether the lease will allow you to let the property out as individual rooms. Some leases actually stipulate that if you are letting the property out, you have to do buy-to-let as a single unit. In other words, you have to let the property out as a whole rather than splitting it up in parts, in rooms, like an HMO. Now, flats, of course, are very good for serviced accommodation, but not all freeholders will share your enthusiasm for your serviced accommodation flat. Many leases will specifically prohibit this sort of short-term rental. There are good reasons for this, because if you're renting your property out to a new tenant every weekend, and they're coming up all the communal areas with their suitcases every weekend, you're going to get plenty of scuff marks around the communal hallways and all of that. That means more painting and maintenance, and that's a cost that's shared among all the other leaseholders. So it's a little bit unfair that everyone has to pay the costs for your profit in serviced accommodation. And that's why a lot of leasehold blocks specifically prohibit serviced accommodation rental. So when you're buying a leasehold flat, do make sure you can actually do what you want to do with it and check that the lease doesn't prohibit or require permissions for you to do what you want to do. With share freehold, particularly smaller blocks, you tend to find there may be, you're of course governed by the lease, but you tend to find there's a little bit more flexibility with what you can and can't do. So what type of property should you buy as a property investor? Well, if you're outside London and the big major cities, I would recommend you go for freehold houses. The classic 2 to 3 bedroom family houses tend to give you the right balance between rental yield and purchase price and maintenance costs and all of that. And you also have complete freedom to offer it to the market as an HMO, as serviced accommodation. You've got permitted development rights, and you can make whatever alterations or extensions you like without asking for any sort of freeholder's consent or anything like that. Of course, subject to permissions from your local authority. If you're in London or some of the UK's regional cities, then of course, freehold houses may simply be too expensive. In the UK, the average house price is now something like £250,000, but it's very, very hard to find a freehold house in London for anything less than £400,000. So that means you've got to go for flats. Now, my preference for investing in high value areas is always to go for flats with share of freehold. With share of freehold, I find that you don't have the ticking time bomb problem of a lease. You tend to have lower service charges than if there's an external freeholder. And there's also some icing on the cake. You benefit from future development. Now, what do I mean by that? There are some blocks of flats where it's possible to build additional accommodation elsewhere in the grounds, or even on top of the existing building. There are permitted development rights now for people to add a couple of floors on top of existing blocks of flats. But if you've got a leasehold flat here, then of course, if the freeholder applies for permission to build another couple of floors on top, then that's all the freeholder's profit, and you get nothing for all the inconvenience. Whereas if you own a share freehold flat and you own 25% of the freehold, then if you collectively want to put a couple of floors on top of your building, then you're down for 25% of that profit. So in high value areas, focus on share of freehold flats. If you must buy leasehold, then make sure that the lease remaining is at least 125 years, so you don't have that ticking time bomb in any time in the near future, and make sure that service charges are reasonable. With everything that I've told you about share freehold flats, you'd think these would be a lot more expensive than regular leasehold flats, right? Well, not necessarily. It all depends, quite frankly. What I find is when the market is heated like it is now, there's pretty much not much difference between a share freehold flat and a normal leasehold flat. And I think that's because of this, because a lot of leasehold flats are bought by first-time buyers. And I think when first-time buyers enter into the housing market, they don't know about this stuff. They go in rather blind and they think they're getting their lovely little penthouse flat, and they don't really understand the issues with ground rent, service charge and all of this, and they don't really understand the difference. And that's why I find that when the market is heated and there are lots of first-time buyers in the game, there isn't really much price difference between share freehold flat and leasehold flat. But when the market is a little bit softer and there are more investors in the game, you tend to find there is a difference between share freehold and leasehold, and the investors, the savvy investors, tend to favour the share freehold. And finally, if you're looking at commercial property or mixed-use shops and uppers, and you're looking at converting commercial properties to residential use, then always go for freehold. Of course, it's the classic. If you're the freeholder, you can just implement your permitted development rights and you're good to go. If you're not the freeholder, if you're the leaseholder, you've got to ask the consent of the freeholder, and they're going to want a slice of the action in exchange for that. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed this video, do smash that like button, but also subscribe and hit the bell icon. You'll get videos as soon as we release them. I've also got some free training on what I believe is the #1 strategy for right now, which is investing and buying commercial buildings which you can repurpose to other uses. To find out more about that, just go on this web link here, property-workshop.com, and see you guys in the next video.